I want you to walk out of your front door tomorrow morning, and I want you to really look at the landscape around you.
Just actually observe it.
Yeah. You hop in your car, you drive down the highway, you pass this gleaming glass financial district, right? And then, literally 10 minutes later, you're driving past boarded-up storefronts and completely collapsing infrastructure.
It's jarring when you actually pay attention to it.
It really is.
It's
And when you
obvious.
look at that, the sheer concentration of power in certain zip codes versus the absolute crushing desolation of others, it is so deeply comforting to believe that it all just sort of naturally occurred.
Right, like it's just the weather.
Exactly. Like
Right.
it's this inevitable, accidental outcome of human variance. I mean, we tell ourselves some people are just inherently smarter,
Mhm.
some grind harder, and the market just neutrally rewards that hustle. And boom, society organically organizes itself into winners and losers.
It is the ultimate illusion of the neutral terrain. I mean, we are relentlessly conditioned, practically from birth, to view our socioeconomic hierarchy as a force of nature. Like tectonic plates shifting. You don't scream at a thunderstorm for raining on you, right? You just accept it.
Yeah, you just buy an umbrella.
Exactly. And that passive acceptance is exactly how the modern economic system is engineered to be perceived. It demands you view your poverty or, your neighbor's poverty as a tragic but totally natural phenomenon.
The deeper you look into the actual mechanics of how we live, you realize it is a complete and utter mirage, which is why this entire deep dive is dedicated to completely ripping the polite, civilized facade off that illusion.
It is long overdue.
We are going to deconstruct the architecture of inequality. Because you aren't driving through some naturally evolved forest of human endeavor. You are navigating a heavily gerrymandered, aggressively zoned, meticulously engineered city.
Every single brick.
Yes.
Yeah.
Every dead end, every gated community, every crumbling public bridge, and every fast lane bypass was intentionally poured in concrete by the architects of this system. The societal rot we see isn't the system breaking down. It is the system functioning with ruthless mathematical perfection.
It is a rigged game, legally and structurally designed to filter wealth upward at maximum velocity. And at the same time, they deploy this sophisticated psychological apparatus to convince the people at the bottom that their lack of capital is this profound personal failure.
It's a total mindfuck.
It really is. And if we are going to understand the brutal reality of the penthouse-like, how it's funded, who gets to hold a key, and the extreme violence required to keep everyone else out, we can't just look at current events. We have to excavate the foundational blueprints.
Right.
We have to look at the historical and sociological bedrock that this entire architectural clusterfuck rests upon.
So that means winding the clock back to the tectonic shift that built the modern world, the Industrial Revolution. That massive bloody pivot from agrarian dirt farming right into the absolute meat grinder of industrial capitalism.
That's where the concrete gets poured.
Exactly. And you can't look at the blueprints of modern power without starting with the heaviest, most polarizing hitter of them all, Karl Marx. And, just to be clear, we aren't talking about 20th century geopolitical regimes here.
No, not at all.
We are talking about his raw analytical framework for how power actually operates.
Right, historical materialism. Because if you strip away the centuries of political baggage, Marx performed a brutal mathematical autopsy of society. He looked at the staggering chaos of the Industrial Revolution and reduced it to a binary, almost predatory simplicity.
The relations of production.
Yes. In his view, the world was violently bifurcated into two mutually exclusive classes. You have the bourgeoisie, the owners of the factories, the land, the raw capital, and you have the proletariat, the laborers.
And the defining, visceral reality of the proletariat is that they own absolutely nothing except their physical bodies and the minutes on a clock.
That's all they have to bargain with.
Right. To literally not starve to death on the street, they are forced to rent that body and that time to the owners.
And within that transaction, Marx identifies the core grift of the entire global economy. It's this concept called surplus value.
So let's unpack that because it's crucial.
Well, in this framework, inequality is not just some static state of being where, some people just happen to have more and some have less. It is an active, ongoing parasitic extraction. The owner never, under any circumstances, pays the worker the actual value of the goods they produce.
Let's ground that in a modern reality for a second. Imagine you work in a massive e-commerce fulfillment warehouse. You are running yourself into the ground, tracking your bathroom breaks on a digital scanner, right?
A total dystopian nightmare.
Exactly. And in 1 hour, your physical labor packs and ships $1,000 worth of profit for the company. But your wage for that hour is $25. if you're lucky.
Right. So that remaining $975 is the surplus value. It is functionally unpaid wages. The shareholders pocket that massive discrepancy, and they just politely label it profit.
The math is entirely undeniable. Profit isn't some magical reward for abstract innovation. Profit is the precise, granular measurement of human exploitation.
It's just unpaid labor.
Exactly. And Marx argued that everything else in society, the laws, the media, organized religion, the state apparatus itself, forms a superstructure. And that superstructure exists strictly to protect and legitimize that specific economic extraction.
Like how the laws are written to criminalize theft by the poor, but they totally protect wage theft by the rich.
Precisely. Or how religion tells the exploited laborer to turn the other cheek, accept their suffering now for a reward in the afterlife, which ensures they remain perfectly docile on the assembly line.
I mean, I follow the brutal logic of that mathematical extraction, but I have to push back hard on this pure Marxist framework.
Go for it.
It feels completely suffocatingly financially reductionist.
Sure. If we boil every single human interaction, every hierarchy, every instance of marginalization down to just a simple paycheck and who owns the warehouse, don't we completely overwrite the terrifying, visceral realities of things like racism, sexism, and just general social prestige?
There's a massive blind spot.
Right. Because a wealthy black man and a wealthy white man might both own the factory, but their lived experience of power in the world is profoundly different. Oppression isn't always just a balance sheet.
That is the most potent critique of classical economic determinism, and it is the exact intellectual pivot that brings us to Max Weber.
The 3D chessboard.
Exactly. Weber looked at Marx's autopsy and essentially said, you've correctly identified that society is playing a game, but you think it's checkers. It's actually three-dimensional chess. So Weber introduced a tripartite model that completely revolutionized how we map out systemic power: class, status, and party.
So breaking down that 3D chessboard, class is the baseline, right? That's essentially the Marxist dimension. Your raw economic resources, your money, your market situation.
Correct. But then Weber injects status. Status is the social prestige, the honor, the cultural estimation of a person or group.
Like having the right last name.
Yes. It is the lifestyle you lead, the elite university you attended, or the arbitrary social value placed on your racial or religious identity within a specific culture. And finally, you have party.
And this isn't just about, like, voting for Democrats or Republicans.
Yeah. No, this is raw, organized political juice. It's your ability to mobilize, to influence the state apparatus, and directly write or rewrite the laws to your advantage.
The fascinating dynamic here is how these three dimensions can aggressively contradict each other.
Yeah.
Let's construct a scenario. Imagine a universally revered, deeply ascetic religious leader living in a slum.
Okay.
From a pure class perspective, they have zero economic power. They are destitute. But their status is astronomical. Millions of people hang on their every word.
High status, low class.
Exactly. Now flip the board. Imagine a newly minted, unbelievably ruthless cartel boss. They have billions laundered through offshore accounts. Their economic class is stratospheric.
Right, they have all the money in the world.
But their status, they are entirely locked out of polite high society. They're viewed as toxic, and they are socially despised.
And that cartel boss might attempt to utilize the third dimension, party, by bribing judges and funding local politicians to artificially protect his wealth, specifically because his lack of status leaves him vulnerable.
It's a constant balancing act.
Weber really understood that power is multifaceted. He defined power simply as the ability to achieve your will despite the resistance of others. And frankly, what terrified Weber about the future wasn't Marx's vision of a bloody proletarian revolution.
He had a much colder fear.
He feared the iron cage. He theorized that modern society was marching irreversibly toward a hyper-rationalized, cold, sociopathic, bureaucratic nightmare. A reality where human vitality is entirely crushed under the weight of spreadsheets, institutional rules, and this asphyxiating obsession with efficiency.
So Marx sees a ticking time bomb of revolution, and Weber sees a suffocating, eternal cubicle. But then we have to look at the third foundational architect, Emil Durkheim.
The functionalist.
Yeah, Durkheim looks at the exact same industrialized landscape and takes a totally different, almost optimistic, biological approach to the whole mess.
Durkheim is the father of structural functionalism. He aggressively rejected the idea that society is fundamentally a war between classes. Instead, he proposed that society operates exactly like a living, complex biological organism.
I see.
To explain this, he differentiated between mechanical and organic solidarity. In ancient traditional societies, you had mechanical solidarity. Everyone farmed, everyone worshipped the same deity, everyone shared a monolithic moral code. The societal glue was absolute sameness.
But throwing an industrial revolution into the mix completely shatters that sameness.
It obliterates it. We transition into modern, hyper-complex societies held together by organic solidarity. Because of the extreme division of labor, self-sufficiency becomes impossible.
Right, you can't build your own smartphone and grow your own wheat.
Exactly. The tech engineer relies on the barista relies on the mechanic relies on the surgeon. We operate like the organs of a human body, highly specialized, entirely different, but totally interdependent for survival.
I mean, that sounds incredibly harmonious on paper. In Durkheim's mind, social stratification, the fact that the heart surgeon lives in a mansion while the guy picking the coffee beans lives in poverty, is just a natural, functional reflection of this complex division of labor. He genuinely viewed it as a meritocratic necessity.
He really did. He assumed the most capable people naturally filter into the most demanding roles. That is the core functionalist defense of inequality.
But this requires us to ask a deeply cynical question. How did the modern architects of inequality take that exact innocent-sounding philosophy of a natural biological organism and weaponize it?
Oh, they mutated it completely.
How did they turn Durkheim's theories into an impenetrable ideological shield to justify paying themselves hundreds of millions of dollars while structurally starving the working class?
That mutation is everything. Because Durkheim's foundational idea evolves into the absolute bedrock of the meritocracy myth that absolutely dominated the 20th century.
We have to dive into the intellectual street fight of the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah.
This was a war over whether extreme inequality is actually a necessary mechanism for human survival. Let's start with the Davis-Moore thesis of 1945.
Davis and Moore weaponized functionalism. They essentially argued that extreme socioeconomic inequality is not just inevitable, it is highly desirable.
Which is a wild claim to make.
It is. Their underlying logic relies on a very specific view of human nature. They state that society has critical functional prerequisites. We desperately need brilliant neurosurgeons. We need visionary civil engineers to design bridges that can withstand earthquakes.
Right.
But acquiring those elite skills requires immense personal sacrifice. A decade of grueling study, sleep deprivation, crushing financial debt, and intense stress.
I can hear a listener thinking right now, well, yeah, that makes sense. I want the person cutting into my frontal lobe to be heavily motivated and well compensated.
Oh, of course.
The Davis-Moore logic assumes human beings are inherently self-interested. Why on earth would someone subject themselves to 12 years of brutal medical residency if they're going to get paid the exact same hourly wage as someone sorting mail in a post office?
That is the exact crux of their argument.
Right.
They claimed society must bribe its most talented citizens to take on these grueling vital roles. The bribe is disproportionate wealth, massive social prestige, and unassailable power.
So the inequality is the feature, not the bug.
Exactly. Therefore, they argued, the extreme stratification we see isn't a rigged game. It's just society's highly efficient, unconscious sorting algorithm. It places the best people into the most important jobs.
It became the ultimate bulletproof justification for the status quo. The billionaire gets to look in the mirror and say, well, I am vastly wealthy because society desperately requires my unique genius to function.
It sounds so clean, so perfectly logical, and it held water right up until 1953 when a sociologist named Melvin Tooman stepped up and absolutely dismantled this framework down to the studs.
It is one of the most brilliant intellectual bloodbaths in modern thought.
Truly. Tooman looks at the Davis-Moore thesis and says, this isn't empirical science. This is a retroactive justification for elite greed.
Tooman's takedown is so devastating because he targets the core pillar of the argument, functional importance. Davis and Moore operate on the assumption that we can objectively measure how vital a job is to a society's survival and that wages reflect that importance.
And Tooman proves this metric is complete bullshit.
My absolute favorite thought experiment from Tooman is comparing the garbage man to the advertising executive. Let's apply the Davis-Moore logic in real time here.
Okay, let's do it.
The senior advertising executive is pulling down $5 million a year with massive stock options. The city sanitation worker is making $40,000 a year. According to the meritocracy myth, the ad exec must be functionally exponentially more critical to our collective survival.
That's the logic.
But let's run the simulation. The entire advertising industry goes on strike for a month. What actually happens to society?
We see fewer billboards, maybe consumer spending shifts slightly. Society is marginally less optimized for consumption, but it continues completely uninterrupted.
Exactly. Now, the sanitation workers go on strike for a month.
Total, cascading societal collapse.
Yep.
The streets immediately fill with rotting waste. Rat populations explode. Untreated biological hazards seep into the water supply. Within weeks, cholera, dysentery, and typhus rip through the urban population, and the city becomes fundamentally uninhabitable.
From a pure biological survival of the species standpoint, the sanitation worker is infinitely more important than the advertising director.
Without a doubt.
Yet, look at who holds the key to the penthouse and who is struggling to afford basic groceries. The reward structure has absolutely nothing to do with functional societal survival.
If the math of functional importance is a lie, then what is actually dictating this extreme inequality? Tuman provides the answer: artificial gatekeeping and the hoarding of systemic power.
It's a cartel.
Exactly. The elite groups, whether we're talking about medical boards, elite bar associations, or insular corporate executive networks, utilize their massive accumulated power to aggressively restrict access to their own professions.
They engineer artificial scarcity.
Precisely. If you want to ensure wages for a specific profession remain astronomically high, you don't just rely on consumer demand. You artificially choke the supply. You severely cap the number of medical school residencies available each year.
You make the licensing exams and the required unpaid internships prohibitively expensive for anyone not born into wealth.
You create a legislative moat around the profession. It is not a free market of talent organically rising to the top. It is a heavily fortified, highly regulated cartel.
Which leads to Tuman's most haunting realization: the talent graveyard.
Yes.
The functionalists claim that staggering inequality is the only way to motivate the best and brightest. Tuman counters that extreme stratification is actually the single greatest suppressor of human potential ever devised.
It crushes potential.
Think about the mechanics of this. When you build a society with rigid, heavily fortified class lines, you practically guarantee that a thoroughly mediocre, completely uninspired kid born to a billionaire will inevitably be handed the keys to a corporate empire.
While simultaneously, a brilliant, once-in-a-generation mind born into a deeply impoverished, heavily policed zip code is starved of the foundational resources required to even enter the race.
They never even get to the starting line.
The systemic lack of basic nutrition and food deserts, the collapsing public education, the chronic stress, these factors ensure that potential genius is completely neutralized.
It is an incalculable loss of human capital. Millions of potential innovators, scientists, and leaders will spend their entire lives merely trying to survive the week instead of innovating for the species.
It's tragic.
And when you structure a society around this kind of artificial scarcity, gatekeeping, and talent suppression, the damage isn't just contained to an abstract economic ledger. It bleeds directly into the physical world. It manifests as a highly toxic, terminal social rot.
We really have to examine the visceral, biological consequences of living inside this hyper-stratified architecture. This isn't just a debate about fiat currency or tax brackets. Extreme inequality is a deadly public health determinant. It is biological warfare by policy.
The epidemiological data on this is absolutely chilling. When you take a society with a relatively flat wealth distribution and compare it to a society with extreme stratification, the highly unequal society uniformly exhibits catastrophic public health outcomes.
Across the board.
We are talking about plummeting life expectancies, horrific rates of infant mortality, and soaring metrics of chronic physical and mental illness.
And it is critical to understand the biological mechanism behind why this happens. Yes, material starvation is a massive factor, the sheer lack of access to clean water, nutritious food, and preventative health care. But there is a secondary invisible killer.
The stress.
The biological weathering caused by chronic psychosocial stress, the trauma of occupying the bottom rung of a hyper-competitive, structurally humiliating hierarchy.
You are talking about allostatic load. Let's break that down for the listener. This isn't just feeling stressed after a long day at work. This is the physiological reality of living under perpetual threat.
Exactly. The human sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response, is designed to handle acute temporary threats. A tiger jumps out of the bushes, your amygdala dumps cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream, you run, and then the system resets.
Right, the tiger's gone, you relax.
But the human body is entirely incapable of marinating in a toxic bath of cortisol for decades. When a person is structurally impoverished, when they are constantly terrified of arbitrary eviction, when they are humiliated by means-tested welfare systems, when they are one unexpected medical bill away from complete ruin, their fight-or-flight system is perpetually engaged.
There is a tiger in the room with them 24/7.
Yes, and that chronic, low-grade inflammation destroys the cardiovascular system. It suppresses the immune response. It literally accelerates the fraying of telomeres on a cellular level. The inequality gets under the skin and rots the biological hardware from the inside out.
And while the physical bodies of the working class are actively breaking down, the physical landscape of the society is violently fracturing. This is where we see the phenomenon of massive civic decay and spatial segregation.
The total divergence of realities.
The ultra-wealthy look out of their windows at the crumbling public infrastructure, the desperately underfunded public school systems, the collapsing transit grids, and they don't use their resources to fix them. They just secede.
The secession of the elite. They retreat into gated fortresses, heavily guarded private estates, and elite private schools. And this isn't just a physical withdrawal, it is a political withdrawal.
They check out of the social contract.
Once they have physically removed themselves from the public sphere, they utilize their immense lobbying power to completely withdraw their financial support for it. Why would a billionaire consent to paying taxes for a sprawling public hospital network when they retain a private concierge doctor who makes house calls?
They wouldn't. And this spatial segregation breeds a lethal mutual suspicion. When the rich and the working class no longer share physical space, when their kids don't go to the same schools, when they don't utilize the same institutions, the concept of social trust completely evaporates.
It just dies.
You end up with the extreme, vitriolic political polarization and the rapid democratic decay we are watching unfold in real time.
Furthermore, when legitimate institutional avenues for survival, advancement, and basic human dignity are structurally barricaded by this system, human beings do not just lay down and starve quietly, they adapt.
Right.
They turn to illicit economies.
I think this is a crucial point to hammer home. We watch pundits on television clutch their pearls over the drug trade, property theft, and underground black markets, framing it purely as a localized moral failing.
They love to moralize it.
But if you strip away the moralizing and analyze it objectively, turning to an illicit economy is a completely rational, highly logical response to a rigged game. If the front door to economic stability is permanently locked, bolted, and heavily guarded by militarized police, you are going to smash a window to feed your family.
It is the brutal innovation of the structurally excluded. But the profound irony here, the staggering macroeconomic stupidity of this extreme stratification, is that the architecture eventually cannibalizes its own foundations.
How so?
Hoarding vast sums of wealth at the absolute top actually asphyxiates the very engine of the capitalist system itself, consumer demand.
Walk us through the mechanics of that. A lot of people assume that if a billionaire has $100 billion, they're out there creating jobs and stimulating the economy. Why does hoarding wealth fundamentally destroy the system?
It comes down to a concept called the marginal propensity to consume. Let's look at the velocity of money. If you take $10 million and distribute it among 10,000 working-class families, giving them $1,000 each, they spend that money immediately because they have to.
They fix the transmission on their car, they buy groceries, they finally replace a broken refrigerator, they buy their kid a winter coat.
Exactly. That money instantly re-enters the local economy. It pays the mechanic, the farmer, the appliance manufacturer. It generates massive, rapid economic velocity.
But if you hand that exact same $10 million to a single billionaire,
they don't go out and buy 10,000 winter coats. They already possess everything they could possibly consume, so the money stops moving. They hoard it.
it just sits there.
They park it in non-productive, abstract assets. They buy up residential real estate to extract rent. They hide it in offshore accounts. They dump it into speculative derivatives. It drains the vital lifeblood of consumer demand entirely out of the system.
Which leads to an economy plagued by sluggish growth and stagnation. But the system still needs consumers to keep buying things to maintain corporate profits, even though wages have been suppressed for decades. So how does the system bridge the gap between stagnant wages and the rising cost of living?
Debt.
Yep.
The system forces the working and middle classes into massive, compounding, inescapable consumer debt just to maintain a baseline standard of living. It replaces actual wage growth with high-interest credit cards and predatory auto loans.
It creates a highly fragile, debt-fueled house of cards that inevitably collapses into catastrophic financial crises, wiping out whatever meager wealth the lower classes managed to scrape together.
It's cyclical violence.
So let's summarize the reality of this architecture so far. The public health is failing, the physical infrastructure is crumbling, the economy is structured to periodically crash, wiping out the middle class. If the results of this extreme stratification are visibly disastrous and genuinely painful for the vast majority of the population, how the hell do the elites prevent a perpetual riot?
Good question.
How do you convince millions of people to wake up every day and enthusiastically participate in a system that is actively bleeding them dry? You have to deploy a massive, highly sophisticated, intensely weaponized psychological mindfuck.
You have to engineer a cultural ideology so pervasive that it makes the abused aggressively defend their abusers. And the most successful, most resilient ideological framework ever constructed to achieve this is the myth of the free market, specifically as it has been deployed through neoliberalism over the last 50 years.
Let's dismantle the free market myth first, because it is the cornerstone of the brainwashing. We are relentlessly fed this narrative that markets are natural, uncontrollable forces.
Like gravity.
Right. You hear financial pundits talk about the market deciding, or the market correcting itself, as if they were discussing the oracle at Delphi, or a gravitational force that cannot be tampered with, lest we anger the gods. It is complete ideological gaslighting.
A market is in no way a state of nature. A market is a highly contested, meticulously engineered, fiercely regulated legal and political construct.
The analogy I always return to is a heavily regulated casino. The house desperately wants you to believe that the games are governed by the pure, unadulterated laws of probability and luck. They want you to think it's a level playing field.
But the house built the tables.
Exactly. The house wrote the rules of the games. Every single facet of a market, what can legally be commodified, how aggressively labor unions are allowed to organize before the state crushes them, how intellectual property is violently protected by international law, how corporate bankruptcy allows an executive to retain their multi-million-dollar mansion while a 22-year-old student debt is legally inescapable.
All of these are deliberate political choices. They are rules written by the state, explicitly at the behest of those who already hold the chips, to ensure they never lose their statistical advantage.
The house always wins.
Always. The distribution of wealth isn't the natural outcome of a free market. It is the legally mandated outcome of a deeply compromised political system. And the ideology that took this casino logic and infected every single level of global governance is neoliberalism.
Let's talk about the brutal, mechanical rollout of neoliberalism. Because this wasn't some peaceful democratic awakening where citizens collectively decided to dismantle the state. We're talking about the late 20th century. And the origins are steeped in authoritarian violence.
It was an aggressive, systematic assault on the post-war welfare state. Neoliberalism demands three core pillars: the total privatization of public assets, the violent deregulation of labor and financial markets, and the absolute gutting of social safety nets.
And if you look at how it was introduced, it was essentially beta tested in Chile under the brutal U.S.-backed military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet.
Yes, it was guided by economists who viewed human rights and democratic pushback as mere obstacles to market efficiency.
And once the proof of concept was established via military junta, it was exported to the democratic West. You get Margaret Thatcher in the UK dismantling the mining unions. You get Ronald Reagan in the US rolling out trickle-down economics.
And the massive austerity cuts in Canada throughout the 90s that decimated public housing and healthcare funding.
But to convince democratic citizens to voluntarily vote away their own public wealth and protections, the elites couldn't just use force. They utilized a profoundly cynical, highly effective academic framework called public choice theory, heavily championed by figures like James M. Buchanan.
Public choice theory is the insidious intellectual scaffolding of neoliberalism.
Break down how this theory operates, because it is a masterclass in psychological manipulation.
It essentially takes the most cynical, ruthless economic view of human nature and applies it directly to government. Public choice theory argues that politicians, civil servants, and even voters are entirely incapable of caring about the common good.
It assumes everyone is selfish.
Exactly. It posits that everyone is strictly a self-interested actor seeking to maximize their own personal power and wealth. Therefore, the theory dictates any state intervention in the economy will inevitably, unavoidably, lead to massive corruption, bureaucratic bloat, and tyranny.
It is an incredibly strategic narrative. By successfully painting the democratic state as inherently corrupt, bloated, and inefficient by its very nature, The corporate elite managed to convince the public that the only logical, rational solution was to hand massive public wealth, utilities, and infrastructure over to private, profit-driven corporations.
The logic sold to the public was, well, the government is a parasite, so let's give the keys to the water supply and the power grid to the billionaires. Because the magic of the market will force them to run things efficiently.
It's an incredible trick. And while the macroeconomy is being systematically plundered through privatization, the public is kept docile and distracted on a micro level through the cultural deployment of bootstrapping ideology.
The rugged individualist pull yourself up by your bootstraps narrative.
This is where the psychological control becomes truly sadomasochistic. It takes massive, sweeping systemic failures and hyper-individualizes them.
It demands that if you are impoverished, you must look inward. It is designed to deliberately obscure the massive historical weight of systemic racism, inherited wealth, structural wage suppression, and legislative abandonment.
Think about the cruelty of this. If you were working 2 precarious gig economy jobs and you still can't afford a 1-bedroom apartment because predatory private equity firms have bought up all the housing stock in your city to artificially inflate rents.
Right.
Bootstrapping ideology looks you in the eye and tells you that you are poor because you lack moral fortitude. You didn't grind hard enough. You bought too much avocado toast. You don't possess the requisite hustle mindset.
It is arguably the most effective mechanism of societal control ever invented because it points the pitchforks inward.
Exactly. It transforms what should be justified structural rage against a rigged system into deep, paralyzing, isolating personal depression. You do not riot against the landlord or the hedge fund if you genuinely believe it is your own fundamental failure that you can't pay the rent.
And with the public thoroughly distracted, burdened by intense personal shame, and stripped of their collective political power, the corporate elites were completely free to enact the next phase.
A restructuring.
They fundamentally restructured the global economy. We transitioned away from an economy that actually built tangible things into an economy designed purely to extract wealth from existing assets. Welcome to the era of the rigged casino.
We have to dive into the transition to financialized capitalism, the absolute dominance of the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate.
In traditional industrial capitalism, as brutal, exploitative, and dangerous as it was, wealth was primarily generated by producing tangible goods. You built cars, you harvested crops, you manufactured washing machines.
But the FIRE sector is different.
It's a total paradigm shift. It doesn't produce things. It produces debt. It is a rent-seeking monstrosity that has swallowed the real economy whole.
It's the art of making money off of money without ever contributing a single atom of value to human existence.
Exactly. It is the extraction of wealth through compounding interest on inescapable consumer debt, hyper-speculative algorithmic trading on abstract derivatives, and, most devastatingly for the average person, the absolute financial commodification of basic human shelter.
That is the most painful one to watch unfold. Housing is no longer viewed by the system as a fundamental human right, or even simply a place to live and raise a family. It has been transformed into a highly speculative, heavily leveraged financial asset traded on global markets by faceless equity firms.
And this financialization exacerbates inequality at terrifying speeds, because making money from capital gains and asset appreciation is heavily legally protected. It's taxed at a fraction of the rate of actual physical sweat-producing wage labor.
And while the financial sector is acting like a parasite draining the blood out of the broader economy, the remaining actual industries are frantically consolidating into massive, unassailable monopolies and oligopolies.
We are constantly sold this romantic myth of vibrant, cutthroat capitalist competition driving down prices and increasing innovation.
But you walk into a grocery store, you try to get a cell phone plan, and you instantly realize the myth is a total fabrication.
Look at the Canadian corporate landscape as a prime example of this. The telecommunications sector, the domestic banking industry, the grocery retail market, these aren't free markets. They are textbook oligopolies.
A tiny handful of massive corporations dominate the entire landscape. They don't actually compete in any meaningful way. They implicitly collude.
They erect insurmountable financial and regulatory barriers to ensure no new competition can ever emerge to threaten their margins.
And when you establish an oligopoly, you achieve absolute power over both ends of the economic spectrum simultaneously. You can artificially inflate prices for the consumer at will, because where else are they going to buy their groceries or get their internet?
And simultaneously, you can brutally crush the wages of your workers because you are effectively the only major employer in town. It is a quiet, highly efficient, heavily legalized vacuum cleaner, sucking wealth out of the pockets of millions of ordinary citizens and depositing it directly into the offshore accounts of a tiny executive class.
Which brings us to the ultimate grift of the modern era, the tax system. The sheer volume of wealth concentrated at the very top is largely shielded from the state, and by extension, the public, through the crucial legally fabricated distinction between tax evasion and tax avoidance.
This distinction is everything. It is the difference between a criminal and a CEO.
The analogy I use for this is visceral, but it's accurate. Tax evasion is putting on a ski mask, walking into a local bank with a sawed-off shotgun, and robbing the teller. It's illegal, it's messy, it's desperate, and if you get caught, the state will lock you in a cage for 20 years.
Right. And tax avoidance.
Tax avoidance is buying the bank, deploying a fleet of lobbyists to rewrite the legal security protocols so the vault automatically unlocks for you every Tuesday at midnight, and then driving up with a fleet of armored trucks to empty it out in broad daylight.
That captures the mechanics perfectly. Avoidance relies on the hyper-sophisticated utilization of offshore tax havens, Byzantine shell companies nested inside other shell companies, intellectual property shell games where a company claims its profits were actually generated in Ireland or Bermuda.
And deliberate, heavily lobbied accounting loopholes.
These loopholes aren't mistakes. They are specifically written into the tax code by the lobbyists of the very elite who intend to utilize them. It is entirely legal, and it is structurally devastating.
It starves the state of billions in public revenue, effectively forcing the tax burden of maintaining roads, hospitals, and basic civilization entirely down onto the shoulders of the working and middle classes.
And if a listener wants a historical masterclass in how this kind of elite lobbying and deregulation directly murders systemic stability, we only have to look at the catastrophic history of the Glass-Steagall Act.
Glass-Steagall is the perfect, tragic case study of absolute state capture. Following the total economic devastation of the Great Depression, the U.S. government passed the Banking Act of 1933. Embedded within it were the Glass-Steagall provisions.
This legislation erected a massive, impenetrable regulatory firewall within the banking system. It strictly separated boring, everyday commercial banking, the place where you keep your checking account and get a modest mortgage, from the high-risk, hyper-speculative gambling of investment banking on Wall Street.
The logic was incredibly sound. The government essentially said, look, if the Wall Street investment bankers want to snort cocaine and bet billions of dollars on obscure financial derivatives, fine. But they absolutely cannot use the life savings and retirement funds of everyday citizens to bankroll those psychotic bets.
It was a necessary quarantine. It protected the core functioning economy from the casino. But the financial sector absolutely despised this restriction. It limited their leverage. So for decades, they launched a relentless, multi-million-dollar lobbying campaign.
They funded think tanks to produce papers claiming the regulations were outdated and stifling vital innovation in the global marketplace.
And in 1999, they finally won. The core provisions of Glass-Steagall were repealed.
And what was the immediate result? The firewall came down. We saw the rapid creation of massive, unmanageable, heavily leveraged, too-big-to-fail superbanks. Commercial banks immediately started taking everyday deposit money and buying highly toxic, entirely unregulated mortgage-backed securities.
They essentially integrated the financial poison directly into the municipal water supply.
And less than a decade later, the bill comes due, 2008. The inevitable, catastrophic global financial collapse. Millions of people lost their homes, their pensions, their jobs, and the bankers who engineered the collapse. They were bailed out by the very taxpayers they defrauded, and they kept their bonuses.
It is the ultimate, undeniable proof that elite deregulation isn't about promoting freedom or innovation. It is explicitly about socializing risk, forcing the public to eat the losses while violently privatizing the profits.
But I want to be clear here. This kind of surgical legislative deregulation doesn't just happen because politicians wake up one morning with bad ideas. It happens because they are bought, paid for, and meticulously managed by a highly organized, deeply entrenched corporate elite.
We need to shine a light on the puppet masters. We need to examine exactly how economic hoarding translates into unassailable political hegemony.
First, we have to completely shatter the myth that major corporations are isolated, fiercely independent entities fighting each other in the marketplace.
In reality, the corporate elite is a highly cohesive, incredibly dense, almost incestuous social network. This structural cohesion is achieved primarily through what sociologists identify as directorate interlocks.
The inner circle, the old boys club mapped out on a spreadsheet.
Precisely. If you map out the boards of directors of the major banks, the massive fossil fuel conglomerates, the telecommunication oligopolies, and the major media empires, you don't see thousands of different people. You see the exact same 50 to 100 individuals sitting on each other's boards.
They rotate chairs, they belong to the same hyper-exclusive private clubs, their children attend the same elite boarding schools, they sit on the boards of the same philanthropic foundations.
This dense, overlapping network creates absolute, unbreakable class solidarity among the ultra-wealthy. They know exactly what their shared economic interests are, and they act collectively and ruthlessly to defend them.
And they defend those interests with an absolute onslaught of lobbying. The sheer volume is hard to comprehend. If we look at the Canadian corporate landscape, specifically the fossil capital sector, the massive oil and gas extractors, the data shows that between 2011 and 2018, they logged over 11,400 official lobbying contacts with the federal government.
Break that math down into a daily reality for the listener.
It is staggering. That equates to an astonishing 6 high-level meetings every single working day for 7 years straight. That isn't lobbying. That is a shadow government co-governing the country.
They deploy vast armies of specialized lawyers, former politicians who have slipped effortlessly through the revolving door between public office and corporate boards, and PR mercenaries to draft friendly legislation for the politicians to sign.
They secure billions in state subsidies while simultaneously crushing any attempt at meaningful environmental regulation or corporate taxation.
And yet, that direct, brute force lobbying is only half the battle. The indirect ideological control is perhaps even more insidious. The corporate elite utilizes their massive surplus wealth to fund and manage what we call organic intellectuals.
Right. They bankroll conservative think tanks, powerful policy planning groups, university research centers, and massive media campaigns.
They manufacture a reality. They create a regime of obstruction. They pay intellectual mercenaries, people with PhDs and impressive titles, to go on television networks they also own, to write op-eds in newspapers they also control, convincing the working class public that protecting the astronomical profit margins of billionaire fossil fuel executives is somehow just economic common sense.
They masterfully frame their ecocidal, profit-driven agenda as the public interest. It is total, immersive ideological warfare.
So we arrive at a heavily compromised, entirely corporate-captured state that has structurally engineered massive poverty and extreme inequality. But to maintain the illusion of a functioning democracy, they still have to occasionally address the poverty they've created, if only to manage public optics.
So what kind of narratives do they spin to explain away the visible suffering on the streets? This brings us to what I call the poverty shell game. The sociologist Ruth Levitas brilliantly broke down the 3 distinct discourses on poverty that a society can deploy.
And this is crucial. The discourse you choose totally dictates how you attempt to fix the problem.
Let's start with the most barbaric, punitive approach. MUD, or the moral underclass discourse.
MUD is the deeply paternalistic, neoconservative approach. It aligns perfectly with the bootstrapping ideology we discussed earlier. MUD traces the existence of poverty entirely to the moral decay, behavioral deficiencies, and sheer inherent laziness of the poor.
It argues that people are poor because they lack personal responsibility, they make terrible choices, and they are addicted to the teat of the welfare state.
It is weaponized victim blaming masquerading as social policy. And the policies that flow from MUD are entirely punitive and intentionally cruel.
If you genuinely believe the poor are just lazy, your legislative solution is to make poverty so agonizingly painful and humiliating that they are forced to work. You aggressively slash welfare benefits. You institute drug testing for single mothers trying to get food stamps.
Which, by the way, almost always costs the state more money to administer than it saves, proving it's about humiliation, not economics.
Exactly. You heavily police lower-income neighborhoods, and you effectively criminalize existence. You attempt to starve them into submission.
Then we have SID, the social integration discourse. This is the more polite, centrist, liberal approach that became wildly popular in the 1990s and 2000s under leaders like Clinton and Blair. SID defines poverty and social exclusion purely as an exclusion from the paid labor market.
In this deeply limited view, human worth and societal integration are entirely equated with holding a job, which sounds very reasonable and progressive until you realize the massive, gaping blind spot. It focuses entirely on welfare-to-work programs. Just get a job, any job.
But this completely ignores the staggering reality of the working poor. If you force someone off a meager welfare check and push them into a precarious, minimum wage, highly exploitative job at a mega corporation where they still can't afford rent or food,
Yeah.
you haven't cured poverty.
You haven't integrated them. You've simply changed the flavor from unemployed poverty to wage slave poverty.
Furthermore, SID deeply insults and entirely ignores vital unpaid labor. It treats raising children, caring for elderly parents, or maintaining a household as socially irrelevant and economically invisible simply because it doesn't generate a corporate paycheck or GDP growth.
Which leaves us with the only framework that actually looks at the disease rather than policing the symptoms. RA, the redistributive discourse.
Our day acknowledges the brutal reality. Poverty is a structural disease caused by the mechanics of capitalism we've been excavating. It demands radical structural change rather than behavioral policing.
It calls for aggressive wealth redistribution, the provision of universal basic services like healthcare and housing, completely independent of employment status, the militant strengthening of labor unions, and heavily taxing the hoarded wealth of the elite.
It recognizes that a job isn't a cure for poverty if the job itself is inherently exploitative.
But here is the darkest, most complex part of this entire architecture. Structural poverty isn't dealt out randomly like a deck of cards. It's not an equal opportunity meat grinder. The architects of inequality rely heavily on pre-existing, deeply entrenched prejudices, specifically gender and race, to determine exactly who bears the brunt of this economic exploitation.
Let's dive into the intersectional weaponry they deploy. We have to examine how the architecture utilizes gender segregation to maintain strict hierarchies and maximize the extraction of surplus value.
The labor market is defined by two profound forms of segregation. First, we have horizontal segregation. This is the systemic funneling of women into specific, heavily gendered industries. Caregiving, administrative work, clerical roles, early childhood education. These are historically known as pink-collar jobs.
And the brutal, undeniable reality of horizontal segregation is that society structurally devalues the pay of these professions simply because women are the ones doing the work.
We see this in historical data over and over again. When a field is dominated by men, take computer programming in its early days, or clerical work in the 19th century, the pay and prestige are relatively high. The moment women start entering that field in large numbers, the average pay of the entire profession drops.
It is not about the objective complexity or functional importance of the work. It is strictly about the socially perceived worth of the gender performing it.
Then you have vertical segregation. This is the classic glass ceiling dynamic. Even within the exact same profession, the same hospital, or the same corporate hierarchy, men are overwhelmingly concentrated in the highest paying, highest status executive and authoritative roles, while women remain trapped in lower tier, subordinate, supportive positions.
And driving almost all of this economic suppression is the devastating motherhood penalty. We exist in a society that still relentlessly forces women to bear a vastly disproportionate burden of unpaid domestic labor, the famous second shift.
Child rearing, cooking, cleaning, managing the emotional bandwidth of the household. This structural reality forces women to interrupt their careers, take part-time work, or pass up demanding promotions just to keep their families functioning. And their lifetime earnings are violently, permanently penalized for it.
Meanwhile, men often receive a documented fatherhood premium. Employers view them as more stable, committed breadwinners after they have a child and actually pay them more. It is a completely rigged, highly gendered metric of human value.
And while gender is used to structurally devalue labor, race and colonial history have been utilized through overt state-sanctioned violence to completely dispossess entire populations of their capital, land, and autonomy.
If we look closely at Canada, the most devastating surgical example of institutional racism is the enfranchisement policy embedded within the Indian Act of 1876.
This wasn't just bias or prejudice. This was a deliberate, highly engineered legal mechanism designed to forcibly assimilate indigenous peoples and legally erase them from existence.
Yeah.
The government essentially created a sadistic ultimatum.
Right, they said if you want the right to vote, if you want standard Canadian citizenship, if you want to become a lawyer or a doctor, you have to undergo enfranchisement.
And what that meant legally was permanently surrendering your official Indian status, your treaty rights, and your legal right to ever live in or participate in your home community.
And the government explicitly weaponized patriarchy to accelerate this cultural destruction. Under Section 12(1)(b) of the Indian Act, the rules were deeply intentionally sexist. If an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she was involuntarily and automatically enfranchised.
She was instantly stripped of her status, she was physically and culturally exiled from her reserve, and that loss of status was permanently passed down to her children.
They intentionally targeted the women because they understood that many indigenous cultures were matrilineal. If you break the women, you shatter the cultural transmission.
Conversely, if an indigenous man married a non-indigenous woman, he kept his status and actually conferred it onto his white wife. It was a targeted intergenerational cultural genocide enacted not with bullets, but through bureaucratic paperwork and legislative exile.
And while that specific section was finally repealed in the 1980s, you cannot erase a century of structural exile with a single amendment. The intergenerational trauma, the massive loss of cultural continuity, the severe multi-generational economic marginalization, this history directly mathematically causes the horrific overrepresentation of indigenous peoples in deep poverty and the penal system today.
But of course, the defenders of the modern status quo will throw up their hands and say, well, the laws are changed now. We have civil rights acts.
Right.
We have an anti-discrimination legislation. We live in a post-racial meritocratic society.
Which is, frankly, complete bullshit.
It is. Overt, explicitly racist laws haven't disappeared. They have simply evolved into something far more insidious, highly adaptable, and legally slippery. They've evolved into what the brilliant indigenous author Thomas King famously identified as smiling discrimination.
Smiling discrimination, also known in sociology as covert or colorblind discrimination, is exactly how the system effectively bypasses modern civil rights laws. It is raw bias, carefully veiled behind socially acceptable, highly bureaucratic explanations. King's analysis breaks this modern bigotry down into 4 brutal maxims.
Let's not just list these. Let's build a scene so the listener can feel exactly how this operates in reality. Imagine a black entrepreneur walking into a commercial bank to apply for a standard small business loan. Maxim 1 is unsounded worse treatment.
The loan officer doesn't call him a slur. Instead, the applicant is subjected to an excessively long wait. His paperwork is scrutinized 10 times harder than the white applicant before him, and he is asked for supplementary documentation that isn't standard policy. The treatment is measurably worse, with absolutely no objective financial reason.
Which leads instantly into Maxim 2. Multiple interpretations. Because there are no explicit racial slurs used, because the loan officer is speaking in polite banking terms, the interaction is completely ambiguous.
The applicant knows exactly what is happening. He feels the bias in his bones. But if he speaks up, if he claims discrimination, he is immediately gaslit by the institution. You're overreacting, sir. You're being paranoid. We ask everyone for these documents.
Then the institution deploys Maxim 3, the shield. Socially acceptable excuses. The perpetrator never, ever admits it is about race. They hide firmly behind the clipboard and the algorithm. The loan officer smiles politely and says, "I'm so sorry, it's just company policy. Our risk assessment algorithm flagged your application. It's out of my hands. It's just the numbers."
I always think of it like the polite bouncer at an exclusive, high-end club. 50 years ago, there was an ugly, explicit sign on the door barring certain minorities. Today, the sign is gone.
Right. The bouncer smiles warmly at you, checks his iPad, and says, "So sorry, it's a private corporate event tonight." While simultaneously waving a group of the preferred wealthy demographic right through the doors, it is vicious prejudice hidden behind a polite, impenetrable bureaucratic wall.
Which leads to the final, most damaging maxim of all, 0 legal consequences. Because the bank used an algorithm, because the bouncer smiled and cited a private event, no explicit civil rights were violated on paper.
Smiling discrimination is nearly impossible to prove in a court of law. It requires proving intent, which is entirely obscured. This means the systemic bias continues entirely unpunished, uninterrupted, and highly effective at maintaining the racial wealth gap.
To tear down this massive, intersecting web of economic, racial, and gendered bullshit, we have to demand total clarity on how we analyze the world around us. We cannot let the architects of inequality dictate the narrative or the metrics. We have to see the matrix for what it is.
And that brings us to what I consider the most critical methodological weapon you can possess as a citizen trying to navigate this landscape. Understanding the absolute fundamental difference between causes and correlations.
The elites completely rely on you confusing the two.
Let's make this incredibly concrete to close this out. Correlation simply means 2 things are happening at the same time in the same place. For example, there's a strong statistical correlation between single-parent households and severe poverty.
The neoconservative MUD Discourse pundit goes on a cable news network, points at a chart showing that correlation, and loudly declares, "Look at the data. The moral failure of single motherhood causes poverty. If they just got married, they wouldn't be poor."
Which is a deliberate, highly malicious, deeply ideological lie. A rigorous redistributive analysis looks deeper and identifies the actual structural causes.
The systemic, decades-long defunding of public childcare. The stagnation of minimum wages that haven't kept pace with basic inflation since the 1970s. The predatory commodification of the housing market that makes rent unpayable on a single income.
These are the structural causes that inevitably plunge a single-parent family into poverty. The single motherhood is just the context. The rigged, hyper-extractive economy is the true cause.
If you don't fiercely separate the cause from the correlation, you will spend your entire life treating the symptoms. You will spend your energy blaming the victims, policing the poor, and shaming the marginalized, while the actual disease of hoarded elite wealth and total state capture eats society alive from the inside out.
Inequality is not natural. It is not the weather. It is an intricate, historically grounded, fiercely protected system of power relations. It is maintained by ruthless economic extraction, justified by functionalist meritocracy myths, enforced by state violence and spatial segregation, and obscured by neoliberal gaslighting.
It is a political construct. It is a set of rules drafted by the rich for the rich.
But I want to leave you with the only genuinely optimistic takeaway from this entire exhausting deep dive. Because the architecture of inequality was built by human hands, it can be dismantled by human hands. The rules can be rewritten. The casino can be shut down.
It's entirely possible.
But I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to chew on. A real mind-bender that we haven't even fully addressed yet. We've spent this entire time talking about how the elite fundamentally rely on the exploitation of the working class. Marx's surplus value, the extraction of your physical labor, your time, your sweat. The entire architecture relies on the proletariat building the penthouse.
Right. They need the workers.
But look at the horizon right now. We are rapidly, terrifyingly approaching an era of advanced artificial intelligence, total robotic automation, and absolute algorithmic dominance. What happens to this meticulously engineered architecture inequality when the billionaires no longer even need the proletariat's labor to generate their wealth? If the exploitation of labor is entirely replaced by sheer systemic human obsolescence, what exactly does the basement of this skyscraper look like tomorrow?